But this is something I want to develop in this interview, because when we look back at the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, it seems that the Commonwealth developed many networks all over the planet to extend the interest of some elite circles. And basically, they used a private company to hide criminal organization, and they had a lot of assassins. I have a personal story to tell you, but because maybe you don't know this, but it's a personal experience. Have you ever heard about the crash that took place in Mont-Blanc in 1966? The Air India 101 flight. Have you ever heard about this?
No.
Okay. There was 106 persons that died there, no survivor. Though I believe there was one American citizen in it from Oregon. At the period, they blamed the pilot D'Souza for the crash, but he was a very experienced pilot, in fact. So I'm born at the feet of the Mont Blanc, where it took place. I'm born there. I have a friend who went into the mountain and found pieces of the plane, and he showed me pictures. There was not only the civilian plane there, but also a military aircraft from Italian and NATO on the same area. And on the some pieces there were inscribed U.S. Air Force in it. And he showed me some evidence of an explosion of the civilian plane fuselage. Many people believe it wasn't a crash accident, but an intentional destruction from NATO, because in the plane was the father of the nuclear program of India. I don't pronounce his name because it's very difficult to speak in India. And he was going to Switzerland to make a peace speech publicly about the program. He wanted to use the program, the nuclear program, for peace, not for military. And the Prime Minister of India died few months before in strange circumstances. I see in this kind of tragedy the end of those networks of the Commonwealth, who were at this time assassinated people like Enrico Mattei. They tried with de Gaulle. They were assassinating all the people who were against their interests. So I believe, if we talk about this, that those networks has increased since this period in the world, and it's very difficult to stop this process. In fact, what is your vision about the fact that this Octopussy is a very huge monster, unseen huge monsters?
Well, you're absolutely right, and you're talking about things that are extremely important. The assassination with Enrico Mattei is at the center of this. The Italian head of the ENI oil company, who was very much opposed to the idea of East-West confrontation. I'll give you some other examples. When the Berlin Wall came down, the head of Deutsche Bank at the time was a man named Alfred Herrhausen. And Herrhausen was saying we should not use shock therapy against Russia and Eastern Europe. We should help them build up their industries. They have a skilled workforce. They just had a crappy system. Let's help them modernize it so we can integrate them into the Western system. Herrhausen was assassinated by a non-existent terror unit called the Third Generation Baader-Meinhof. About 3 months later, or 4 months later, Rohwedder, who was in charge of the Treuhand, which is the trust that was supposed to do the transition from communism to a Western economy, Rohwedder was opposed to a total free market shift. He wanted to have a way of propping up and improving the conditions in the East. He was a second target of this non-existent terror operation. In Europe, this goes back to the late 50s and early 60s, something called Operation Gladio. And this is a crucial operation because through NATO, and it goes back before that to the Italian operations, the operations in France against the resistance movement, the French Communist Party, and so on. But there were assassinations, there were dirty tricks, there were all kinds of operations run to destroy anyone who argued that Europe should have an independent policy course. And one of the key people who was targeted was Charles de Gaulle, because de Gaulle was someone who had a different vision for Europe. his idea of Europe, he's probably turning over in his grave over the European Union. He wanted a union in Europe, but he wanted a sovereign nation states allied from the Atlantic to the Urals. He saw Russia as part of Europe. And instead, you had the geopolitical confrontation between East and West. And so, I don't know, there were half a dozen assassination attempts against de Gaulle, many of them run by the CIA probably out of their Rome office, with networks that incorporated French fascists and the remnants of the old Nazi regime that was rescued by Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA until Kennedy fired him after the Bay of Pigs. Now, if you look at Allen Dulles' role in this, you begin to get at the unelected control networks that were a part of American intelligence, British intelligence, and co-opted people from France, Italy, and Germany. And that's why, Germany's a mess today, because its leadership still thinks as an occupied country. And I think that the legacy of de Gaulle has been so smeared and attacked that people, you get someone like Sarkozy, who would occasionally pretend he was a Gaullist, or Jacques Chirac, who was a poor imitation of de Gaulle. There are very few Gaullists left, but this was the target of this British operation. And the British brought the Americans in, and people like James Jesus Angleton, who was the sidekick of Allen Dulles, who ran counterintelligence for the CIA for years. These are the people who most likely were involved in the Kennedy assassination. And what's their legacy today? John Brennan, James Clapper, Susan Rice. You had Fiona Hill testifying against Trump. She's supposedly the top Russia expert. Who was her mentor? It was Pipes and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Brzezinski comes from the same crowd, of these globalists who believe that sovereignty is a threat to a global system of financial elites. Well, look at what's coming out now from the chemical warfare investigation in Syria, the fact that this was a fraud. The Skripal case in London, another fraud. The idea that the Russians shot down the jetliner over Ukraine. There are so many of these frauds. Just last month, there was an assassination of the chief engineer of the modern dam that was just built in Ethiopia. So, people who represent this tradition, and you mentioned India, look at the Gandhi family, what was done to Indira Gandhi and then Rajiv Gandhi. And that's the British playground. You look at the Saudi role, the Wahhabite, that was developed at Oxford, that artificial synthetic version of Islam. Look at the synthetic version of Judaism that presides in Israel now, Zionism. That's another product of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford.
If you look at the transformation of those networks with time, they adapt themselves with the historical process. They were anti-communism at the period of Kennedy, but once USSR failed, they transformed into a group that financed the failed jihadists to destroy, stage this war on terrorism, financing terrorism to justify their interventionism.
No, you're absolutely right. And look, they had to evolve to some extent, because after communism fell, what was the purpose of NATO? Well, all of a sudden, the purpose of NATO is to protect the Ukrainian people, except the people who were doing that destroyed Ukraine. If you look at Ukraine in 1991, it had the 10th largest GDP per capita in the world. Today, Ukraine is 42nd out of 42nd European countries in per capita GDP. Why? The International Monetary Fund and then the Maidan coup in February 2014. The people who were out there complaining that Trump is threatening to bully Ukraine and attack Ukraine and blackmail Ukraine, they're the ones who destroyed Ukraine. Now, did the media report any of it? No, not at all.